In this section, we're going to talk about alphas. Alphas are 2D black and white images that are used to mask brush strokes or to act as height information. They can be applied to brushes for both sculpting as well as painting. They can be converted into stencils, added to surface noise, and you can even use alphas to create new geometry. Let's first look at one of the more common uses of alphas, which is applying them to our brush strokes. You can access alphas by going up to the alpha menu and clicking on this large icon right here will bring up all of the default alphas that are loaded into ZBrush, as well as any alphas that you load yourself. The alpha selection icon is also located on our left shelf right here. If you want to load your own alphas or alphas that you've picked up online, you can do so by clicking on the alpha selector icon and selecting import right here, or you can go up to the alpha menu, and this first button here allows you to import alphas from anywhere on your hard drive. While most image files can be brought in and converted for use as an alpha, ZBrush prefers if your image is a PSD or a TIFF grayscale image at 16 bits. That will make it so that ZBrush doesn't have to convert the file when you import it, which will avoid issues like noise or artifacting that could come in from that process. So I just have my standard brush selected right now. I'm going to go over to the alpha menu selector here, and I'm just going to come in and grab, let's say, alpha 23 here, this sort of scattered dots. Now the first thing that you're going to notice when you click and drag on your mesh is that we don't get a whole lot happening here. The reason for this is there's not enough geometry on our model to represent the alpha detail that's inside of our alpha. So we're going to need more geometry for this to work well. So right now we're only at 8,000 active points for this sphere. I'm going to hit Control D to bring up another subdivision level, and now we're at 32,000. And let's apply that alpha again here, and then make the stroke. And you can see that we're getting more information than we did on our previous stroke. Let's go ahead and divide up again, and when we do that, you're going to see that our previous stroke looks softer. If I hit Shift D to drop my subdivision back down, it hasn't really lost anything. It's just that when you have a higher subdivision level here, because the normal subdivision algorithm is set to smooth, it's going to smooth the surface on the higher subdivision level a little bit. So now with 130, if I come in here and click and drag, again, we're going to get more information. Let's hit Control D a couple of times. And now if I come in, I can get a pretty good solid amount of information from that alpha shown on our model. If I was to divide one more time and bring our model up to 8 million, now you're going to see even higher fidelity to the information in our brushstroke. Now remember that this alpha is being applied to the standard brush. So if I remove the alpha here, the standard brush normally is going to give us a sort of rounded cross-section or profile to our brushstroke. With the alpha applied, it's still doing that. It's just being masked by the dark areas of the alpha. And one thing you can see here is that the center information is a little bit higher, and the information out on the sides is quite a bit more faded, and it actually fades out at the end. We can affect this look by changing some of our settings for our brushes, or by selecting different brushes to apply our alphas with. So let's reselect that alpha that we were using. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the focal shift. If I bring the focal shift down into the negative, you're going to see that that inner circle on my brush icon gets closer to the outer circle. The area in between the two circles is our fall-off radius. So if I bring this all the way down to -100, now there's no fall-off to the brush, and it will remain at 100% from edge to edge. So if I click and drag now, you can see that it doesn't fade out because of the brush stroke. It's only fading out a little bit because the actual alpha itself has some faded edges to it. I could come in here and select a different alpha that doesn't have any sort of vignetting on the side. Say we pick this arrow alpha, and you can see here how crisp that is on the edges, whereas if we have it back to our default of 0, you can see now that that actually has some fading happening on the sides. Another thing that I can obviously do to affect the alpha's look on the surface is by changing my Z intensity, either to make it a much more subtle effect or to make it a much greater effect. Holding Alt is going to do the same thing that it does for brushes without an alpha attached to it. In the case of the standard brush here, it's going to create a subtractive or negative stroke. Other brushes, say like the Damien standard brush, are set up as Z sub to begin with. And so with this alpha in here, it's already going to be set to Z sub. And if I hold Alt, it'll turn it into an additive brush. And you can see here also that the effect of this has a different look to it than the effect of it on a standard brush. So the actual brush that you select will have a great deal of effect to how the alpha looks when you use it. In the case of Damien Standard, it actually pinches toward the center a little bit, which is why we're getting this sharper apex to the center of the brushstroke. So let's try out some different brushes and see how alphas affect their look. We've already used the standard brush. Let's switch to the clay brushes. So I'm going to hit B, C, and L. And the clay brush by default is going to have a much flatter effect to it than the standard brush does, where we have this much more curved profile to the brush. So when we use the clay brush with alphas, it's going to look a little bit different. We can see the effect that we're getting here with alpha 23 versus the standard brush with the same alpha applied to it. Now, part of this has to do with the spacing for this brush. So the way brushes work in ZBrush is very much like how they work in something like Photoshop, where every brush stroke is made up of multiple overlapping instances of an image. If I switch to something like alpha 33 again, this arrow, and I click and drag, you can see that the amount of overlap that we're getting has some gaps or some spacing in it, and so you can actually see with this alpha the spacing of those individual brush dabs. Whereas if we switch to the clay brush and that same alpha, you can see that the individual brush dabs are spaced much more on top of one another, and so we get what looks like a more continuous stroke than we do with the standard brush by default. One of the ways to control this effect is to use a feature in the stroke menu called Lazy Mouse. Now, for the standard brush, Lazy Mouse is already on by default, and we have this lazy step value. And this step value is what's going to determine how much the image instances overlap each other. In this case, it's set to 0.25. So 1/4 of the distance across an individual stroke will be the start of the second stroke. If I choose Clay Buildup, we don't actually have Lazy Mouse on for this. If I turn Lazy Mouse on, and we have a default of, again, that 0.25, and I come up here and do a brush stroke, you can see that the spacing is now the same as it is for our standard brush, even though the effect is still somewhat different in terms of how the brush stroke looks. So I could come up here to the Lazy Mouse and set this above 1 if I want there to be actual space in between the individual instances of that image. We have an entire chapter dedicated to the different things you can do with Lazy Mouse later in the series. Lazy Mouse is just one of the many features inside of the stroke menu that can greatly affect the look of our brush stroke, especially when we have an alpha applied to it. One of the things you'll most often do is select a different stroke type with the stroke selector icon up here at the top of the stroke menu, or located above the alpha selector on the left shelf. Currently, with the standard brush, we have the dots stroke selected, which is going to give me that sort of spaced out dabs that we see with brushes in Photoshop. If I come over and I click on the selector icon, we can see that we have different stroke types that are available. The freehand stroke, for the most part, is going to operate very much the same as the dot stroke in most cases. The drag rectangle stroke is one you'll use quite often, and what this allows you to do is that instead of the brush size controlling the size of the placement of the brush stroke or the alpha, we can simply click and drag with the drag rectangle stroke and rotate around until we get the placement and size of that alpha exactly how we want it. So drag rectangle will apply a single instance of the stroke, but it will allow me to change the size of it dynamically as well as change the rotation. I can't change where that brush stroke is being placed on my model, however. It's going to be placed at the center of wherever I first click and drag out. If I want to have the ability to move that stroke around, I want to switch to the drag dot stroke. With the drag dot stroke, the size of the alpha is going to be determined by the brush size again. However, it's still only going to drag a single instance of that alpha, but that alpha can be moved around and rotated until you let up on your stylus. If I want a larger arrow in this case, I can just increase my brush size, and then I can place a larger one. So even though I've changed my stroke type here, let's bring this back to drag rectangle. I'm still using the standard brush as the brush for my stroke. So if I hold Alt, you can see that I'm still going to get that subtractive effect to the brush stroke, even though I've changed the stroke type. Same thing would happen if I switch to drag dot and hold Alt. I'm going to get that subtractive effect to the brush. Now, if I want a more solid looking arrow than what I'm getting from the standard brush here, I could either adjust my focal shift down to get a little bit crisper effect, or I could switch to a different brush. And one brush that works particularly well, especially for dragging out hard surface alphas like this, is the chisel brushes. So I'm going to hit B, C, and we have a series of chisel brushes in here. I'm just going to go ahead and select chisel rectangle here. And what you're going to see is actually that the chisel brushes have different meshes attached to them. These meshes are actually being stored as alphas, which allows me to have multiple alphas stored in a single brush. But I can also simply use the regular alphas or any alphas that I bring into ZBrush with the chisel brushes as well. So let's just grab that arrow again, and I'll click and drag in here, and you can see that we get a very pronounced, very sharp instance of that arrow. I can come in here and drag the Z intensity down quite a bit, and you can see that we get a nice crisp version of that arrow. I'll hold Alt so you can see it's a little bit sharper than what it is with the standard brush with the focal shift set all the way down. Another stroke type that we can use is called the spray stroke. And this is going to function very similar to the scattering effect in Photoshop brushes. With the spray stroke type selected, when I click and drag, instead of placing each instance of the alpha directly over the center of my brush stroke, it's going to scatter them outwards from the brush stroke a random amount. It's also increasing the frequency of that dab so that we're getting this strong overlapping of the alpha. So with the spray stroke type, we actually have some other modifiers available to us that are not available when we switch to the dot stroke here. You can see that this section here is grayed out, meaning we can't access these controls for the dot stroke. Let's go ahead and switch this back to the spray stroke type. And on here we have now available placement, scale, color, and flow. The placement slider is essentially the scattering slider in Photoshop. By default, it's set to 0.5. If I drop this down and make a stroke, you're going to see that the scattering is much less, and those instances are kept closer to the center of my brush stroke. If I bring this all the way up to 1, now you're going to see a much greater scattering effect. These same sliders are actually located in the pop-up menu when you click on the stroke selector icon. You can see here we have placement, scale, color, flow available to us here so that we don't have to go to the stroke menu every time we want to adjust that. We'll take a look at the color spray stroke type when we get into poly painting in a later chapter. For now, let's take a look at how we can modify the alphas we bring into ZBrush using the tools in the alpha menu located on the left side of our menu bar. So using the alpha menu, we can actually make adjustments to alphas directly inside of ZBrush instead of having to bring them out to another piece of software like Photoshop. Let's go ahead and dock the alpha menu over onto our left tray here. I'm just going to come up and tap on the brush menu here to collapse that down. So the controls for modifying alphas directly inside of ZBrush are located in this Modify palette right here. Let's go ahead and select an alpha. I'm just going to go ahead and select something kind of abstract like alpha 60 here right now. And if I click and drag with this, you see that we get the sort of expected overlapping dab effect that we've talked about earlier. Now the first set of controls in this Modify palette here are actually going to add streaks to the brush stroke. And you might want to do this if you're trying to get a more like paintbrush kind of look to your brush strokes. This can be particularly useful when trying to get a natural sort of paint effect on your model. So I'll come in here and I'll just increase this streak length. And if you look at the alpha selector icon, you're going to see a change when I let up on my stylus. You're going to see that this has shifted and now we have these lines that are being applied directly to the alpha. So if I click and drag in here now, it looks slightly different. If I increase the density on this a little bit, you're going to see that we can actually get different amounts of these streaks onto our alpha, and that can change the look of the alpha a little bit. I can also increase the amount of fall off that these have to change that look as well. Now these are only being applied to the non-black areas of the alpha. You can see that in between the spaces, we're not really getting anything. If I switch to a different alpha, say alpha 7 here, you can see that these settings that I've changed are going to be applied to every alpha. It's not saving it directly onto the alpha. So if I come back to alpha 60 here and I just hover over it, you can see that that alpha still looks like it normally does. But as soon as I select an alpha, it's going to add these settings to it. So these settings will be applied to whatever alpha I select. So I can come in here and with alpha 7, you can see what the effect of that streaks looks like. Or if I switch to something maybe a little bit more, with a little bit more coverage, like this one, you can see that that's the kind of look we're going to get from this alpha with these settings. I can come back in here and bring the streaks length back down to 0, and now we're getting the usual effect. Let's go ahead and go up to the brush menu, and I'm going to do a reset all brushes. And you're going to see that this is going to reset these modifiers back to their default normal settings. And let's pick an alpha that's a little bit clearer, something just like the star alpha here, which has nice sharp edges to it. And the remainder of these controls down here are going to affect different things. We can add noise to our alpha, so I can come in here and add noise, let's change our stroke to the drag rectangle stroke for this. And if I have noise added to it, you can see that that's going to change how that alpha affects our surface versus when there's no noise on it. We also have a noise radius, which will modify that noise as well. So you can see that in this case, the noise having a broader radius is going to create kind of a softer, more mountainous effect rather than the very abrupt noise that we get when the noise radius is low. The blur slider here is going to either add blur if we bring it up to the positive, or going to sharpen if we bring the blur slider down to the negative. So here we've got a somewhat clear but slightly blurry alpha, and if I click and drag this out, this is the kind of effect we're going to get with it with the blur set to 0. If I increase this blur sum, you're going to see that we're going to get a much softer effect. But if I want to sharpen this, I can actually bring it down into the negative range and get a much more crisp surface, which might be really useful if, say, I want to take a alpha that, when set to 0, maybe isn't as sharp as I want it to be. If I then bring this into the negative, now I get a much closer hard surface effect. Next to blur, we have a max range and an anti-alias slider, which will give sort of a different blur effect when using this slider. Let's bring our blur down to 0. And under here we have horizontal tiling and vertical tiling. And obviously if we add this, we're going to get tiling for our alpha. Now, with this right now, I've got my focal shift set at 0, so let me drop this down to the negative. And now we have multiple tiles, and I can set this to whatever value I want. So for surface and mid value, let's import a couple of different alphas. I'll navigate to a place where I have some different alphas that I can pick from here. And it can be kind of difficult to tell when you're looking at the preview inside of ZBrush. But normally, the background of most of these alphas in here is going to be black. And the mid value for an alpha with a black background is usually going to be set at 0. So if I import this alpha here, and we switch our stroke to the drag rectangle, and let's bring our focal shift all the way down to -100. If I click and drag on my model here, it doesn't look like there is anything in my image except for these two capsule shapes. That's because the mid value is set to 0, which is black, which is the same color as the background. But if we load an image with a different background other than black, say this image right here, which has a sort of mid-gray value for its background, and then I rotate my model a little bit and then click and drag this out here, we can clearly see the edge of our alpha because our mid value being set to 0 is the wrong mid value to have the background blend into our model. So what the mid value number does is determine the value at which the alpha has no effect on the model. Now I can manually try to adjust the mid value number here, or I can start off by clicking on this surface button here. ZBrush will then try to determine the background value of the alpha. So it set this to 50, which is mid-gray. So if I come over here and then click and drag on this, you'll see that it did a much better job, but we still have a little bit of that edge showing up. So we'll just change this value a little bit, say bring it up to 51, and then try again. And that's a little bit better. Let's bring it to 52 and try one more time. And now you can see that it's actually going slightly inward here. So we don't have a perfect number value for this particular alpha. What we can do to help blend the edge of this alpha in this case is add a little bit of the radial fade down here. If we add just a little bit of this and then click and drag on our model, you'll see that it's done a better job at overall blending that edge into our model. The seamless slider here will try to create a seamless tile out of your alpha. Intensity and contrast are pretty self-explanatory. And the alpha adjust is essentially like using the curves graph in Photoshop to change the values of the alpha that you're using. If I select an alpha and then make changes using the modify palette down here, and then later want to save this as its own alpha, I can do that by going down to the transfer palette here and clicking on this Make Modified Alpha. That will bake in the changes that I made in the Modify palette into a new alpha. The Create palette works with surface noise, which is something we're going to cover in another chapter. The Make 3D allows you to take your 2D alpha and turn it into 3D geometry. If I click on this Make 3D button here, you'll see that we get a mesh representation of the alpha. I can adjust the different settings here to change the amount of topology that we get. And if I turn off this doubles button here, instead of giving me a double-sided mesh here, it will only give me a single-sided mesh. You can also create geometry from an alpha by simply clicking the To Mesh button here in the top palette of the alpha menu. When I click this, ZBrush is going to create geometry of the entire image, including the areas of black. So that's going to cover this section of alphas. Some of the things like bas relief and make texture and make stencil we're going to cover in their own chapters later on.